I'm Chris Wilson. I'm the Deputy Director of the Mexico Institute here, and I want to welcome you all to our 5th annual Building a Competitive U.S. Mexico Border Conference. Unfortunately, there's not very much going on in U.S.-Mexico relations or border policy or anything like that, so it might be kind of a boring one this year. I'm sorry. Sorry to do that to you. But no, we at the Mexico Institute, we've believed for a long time that one of the keys to creating better border policy is to get people from the border region, people who have a deep knowledge of the border region and border issues here in Washington involved in the conversations about the border. Too often we have those conversations here in Washington without the experts that are many of you who are here in the audience and folks that we have on stage here today with us as well. And that's an important part of the logic of our conference. Another thing we learned, though, over time in our work at the border at the Mexico Institute is that just as often as the border cuts north and south, it can cut east and west. And what I mean by that is that there's oftentimes a lack of communication and collaboration that happens across the 2,000-mile long U.S.-Mexico border region. And that's an artifact of geography. It is difficult to coordinate and cooperate across such a space. But one thing we found, just our small little granito de arena that we can put in there, is to have this conference every year at the same time so that groups from the border can sort of organize around that and come up and be a part of this, and not only be here in Washington and speak to federal officials, but get to know one another and deepen their own bonds of cooperation. And so in that spirit, we have been very fortunate to partner with the Border Trade Alliance on this project for the last 5 years. We also have, and I want to welcome folks from the RGV Partnership, the Rio Grande Valley Partnership, who've also coordinated their trip to Washington this year around the conference so that they could be here. So welcome to all of you. And we obviously have a fantastic group of speakers for you. For those of you who saw the agenda ahead of time, you may have noticed we've had some last-minute changes to our congressional panel, but we're really delighted to have Congressman Hurd and Congressman Correa here. Two people, from both sides of the aisle that have lived and breathed border issues for a number of years and are working on them very hard in Congress as well. Later in the day, we'll hear from Commissioner Macalinen of CBP, Ambassador Zabalagoitia, the DCM, the Deputy Chief of Mission of the Mexican Embassy. We have panels on Nafta, the management of our ports of entry, on border security. So once again, let me just welcome all of you. Let me take just a moment to thank all of our sponsors whose logos you'll see on your agendas for helping make this event possible. And with that, let me pass things over to my colleague Duncan Woods, Director of the Mexico Institute, to moderate this great panel.
Thank you so much, Chris. Good morning, everybody. I think we should begin with a round of applause for Chris, who's done an excellent job again. Well done, man. Very, very important that this issue stays on the agenda. Not that it's likely to disappear off the agenda, as you said, at this particular moment in our country's political history. Let's begin with some good news, shall we?
Please. Please.
Hey, the World Cup's about to start, and in 8 years from now, it'll be happening around here somewhere. So that's good news, right?
Yeah.
In 8 years' time, we may be in a different place in the trilateral relationship. In 8 years' time, we may be actually able to sort of see that this is a bigger reality, a more important reality than what we're witnessing right now. So let's hope. Let's keep our fingers crossed and let's keep our shoulders to the wheel. Let me introduce our two distinguished guests, our honorable guests. Congressman Leukorrhea, welcome. Thank you for coming to the Wilson Center, sir. Great to see you. And Congressman Will Hurd, it's wonderful to have you back again. You're both champions for the border. Let me give a very, very brief, I want to go into your bios. I think a lot of people know who you are and they have the bios in front of you. But Congressman Correa, issues that matter to you, healthcare, mental health, children's issues, the legal rights of immigrants, veterans affairs. A lot of these issues are issues which are really in the eye of the storm right now at the border. And so, I'll be very interested to hear your opinions on some of these things, in particular to do, obviously, with the question of what happens with child migrants and being separated from their parents at the border. Congressman Hurd, distinguished career, obviously in the CIA, which many people know, served in the Middle East and in Southeast Asia. You then went on to a career in cybersecurity. You serve on the Committee on Homeland Security, on Information Technology. You have a number of very, very important roles in the Congress. And once again, I'd like to thank you for not only your leadership on the border, but also your bipartisan approach, which is such an important thing. And I know we say that over and over again here at the Wilson Center, but it's absolutely fundamental that we keep that bipartisan spirit alive. So that's by way of introduction. I would just like to offer you the chance to make an opening statement of around 5 minutes. Congressman Correa, would you like to lead us into the conversation?
I'd be honored.
Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias. Good morning. Bienvenidos a todos, and good morning. Buenos dias. I'm glad to see all of you here today. This most important issue. I'm Congressman Leukorrhea, Orange County, California, and I'm a native Californian. I'm proud to say California today is probably the fourth largest economy in the world. I think we're about to surpass Canada. Despite our high tax, high regulatory environment, we continue to grow and continue to prosper in many ways. California, if we were a nation unto ourselves, which we think we are, we have our own immigration policy, our own energy policy, greenhouse gas policy. We passed the Trust Act, the DREAM Act, driver's licenses. We've done whatever we can in California to come up with our own immigration policy that we believe that California needs to grow. Energy policy, the same thing. We in California are well aware that international trade, being part of the international community, is key to our success. Jerry Brown, before him Arnold Schwarzenegger, a number of trips to Mexico, to China, all again making sure that every Californian prospers. Locally, I don't come close to the border. I'm about 60 miles away from the border, my district is. But my biggest employer is Disneyland. Biggest source of tourists for Disneyland today is Mexico. Business-wise, my dad worked for 30 years making cardboard boxes at a company that's called International Paper. Had a chance to tour them. That was my summer place for my summer jobs. And I had a chance to go visit them about a year ago, and they told me one of their biggest market for exports is Mexico. So when we began to break it all down, you begin to see how critical Mexico is to the economic lifeblood of Orange County and the rest of California. I'm watching with a lot of interest what's going on right now between Mexico, the U.S., and Canada. Before I got to the Congress, I served in the state legislature where I chaired the Select Committee on California-Mexico Relations, and I was also a member of the Border Legislators Conference. Did a lot of work with Ambassador Wayne here as well in Mexico. Discovered that today there are 1 million American citizens growing up in Mexico. All of those are, of course, children, members of deported families that have essentially moved to Mexico and probably will someday very soon move their way back to the U.S. So those cultural, historical, familiar ties between Mexico and the U.S. continue to grow stronger and stronger despite what either government does. And in my opinion, as policymakers here today, tomorrow, it's upon us to make sure that whatever policies we come up with enhance and develop those economic, political relationships. As I think about those 1 million Americans growing up in Mexico, I'm hoping to God that when they come back to the U.S., they come back to study, they come back to be productive members of society and not take any negative routes in their life. You know, Mexico is challenged. They have a lot of violence, a lot of drugs, so on and so forth. And it's easy to point the finger and say it's their problem, but we forget that the reason Mexico in many ways is destabilized is because a few decades ago, we decided that we were going to stop the drug trade to the Caribbean. Therefore, we shut that down, and all we did was push the drug trade from the Caribbean inland through Mexico, and that, of course, has resulted in a lot of violence and a lot of disruption of that country. And until, we in the U.S. stop buying those drugs with American dollars, until we in the U.S. stop exporting our weapons to Central America and Mexico, this is going to continue to be a problem, and it's not us versus them. When we talk about border security, in my opinion, it's not about building a wall. It's about having cooperation with Mexico and their southern neighbors. Recently, there was a lot to do, a lot of news stories about this caravan of migrants coming from Central America, the number was anywhere from 1,000, 1,500, depending on who you listened to. What you didn't hear was that of those 1,500 that may have left Central America, only about 300 made it to the border. And the reason being that I believe, and Mexicans won't say this publicly, but believe the Mexicans have their own resettlement refugee policy in their southern border with Guatemala and some of the other Central American countries. That you never hear about in the newspapers. That does not fit well into our political stories that we're trying to present. Of those 300, 350 refugees that made it to the border, only about 20% of those are actually qualified as refugees. So again, the problem isn't us versus them. This is one hemisphere. We all have to figure out how to work together and prosper as one region. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman Correa. I think we would all in this room share that message. I mean, it is very much about shared responsibility and shared futures as well. Congressman Hood.
Sure. First off, to the Wilson Center, thanks for all that y'all do in highlighting such these important issues. And Paola and the BTA, you guys are a great organization that I know I've relied on for understanding some of these complex issues. And thank you for all that you do. Today, we're probably going to talk about a lot of what I would call acute problems that we're dealing with right now, but there is a larger strategic chronic problem that we have to address, and that is too many Americans don't understand the importance of international trade. And trade should not become a political election year issue, because guess what? Adam Smith kind of sorted this out and said, that international trade is good for economies. Nafta has improved the economy of the U.S., Mexico, and Canada at 400% over those 24 years. And so we have to make sure folks realize that jobs are created in the United States of America from exports, yes, but imports as well. Just ask Toyota in San Antonio, Texas, how many jobs they create. So these are all things that we all know in this room, and this is I'm preaching to the choir here, but we have to make sure that everybody else understands this. And let's say we do get to a good NAFTA 2.0 that we can all agree on. Our jobs aren't over, because we have to continue to educate folks on this. And it's not just members of Congress. We got to stand up and advocate for these, but we need outside groups and organizations to help continue to push that narrative. And that's why I'm always participating, because you all play an important role in this. We need more members of Congress going down to Mexico. Right? I think Mexico City, Ambassador Wayne probably doesn't want to hear this, but Mexico City should host more cotels than any other embassy in the world, right? Because the importance of our neighbor. I find it interesting that we're talking about national security concerns with Mexico and Canada, but we're going to ultimately help a country like China and a company like ZTE, which is a true, real national security threat. We should be thankful that we have Mexico and Canada as our neighbors, and and where the conversation should be is how can we leverage North American competitiveness in other parts of the world? That's where the conversation should be. Unfortunately, we are not there, and part of that is because of different worldview of probably three of the most important people that make decisions on trade. And I want to pick up on something that Lou said. The U.S. Mexico-Canada relationship is bigger than Peña Nieto, Trudeau, and Donald Trump. And the number of states that go to Mexico and Canada, the number of governors that do, the number of states that have a individual or someone in their state administration that's focused on trade with Mexico along the border, that doesn't exist with other countries, and the number of mayors and city councilmen and state reps that go back and forth is high. So that's the unique nature, and sometimes we forget that. Now, prolonged rhetoric in a negative way is going to ultimately have a broader impact on our people, on our culture, on our society. But I believe these relationships are they're deeper, they're more important than just the relationships and what's said at the top.
Thank you so much. Let me just make a couple of plugs here, and it's not for our work. First of all, for the comments that you both just made about how this relationship is so much bigger and so much more important than the current administrations. I urge everybody in the room to read Andrew Seeley's latest book, Vanishing Frontiers, because the point of that book is that Mexico and the United States are coming together in so many ways that don't involve the two governments, and I think it's true, of course, on the North American level, and that this is almost an inexorable process. It's going to keep going, despite the hiccups, despite the steps back, etc. The other thing that I'd like to mention is a comment that was made in an article written by Laura Dawson, the director of our Canada Institute here. She wrote an article in the Washington Post yesterday, and she was talking about the spat between the United States and Canada, and she said, you know, insulting Canada is a little bit like slapping your granny. She's probably not going to slap you back, okay? But it's not very satisfying, and nobody respects you for it afterwards. But I'd be interested in hearing your perspective from the point of view, not of yourselves, but of your constituents, the folks in your district. What is their view of bilateral relations? What is their view of the importance of North America? What are you hearing from people on the ground? Because, I mean, that really is part of the purpose of why we're here.
Thank you, Will. I think we're all scratching our heads in California trying to figure all this out, what is really the issue with Canada, because I believe California has a surplus, trade surplus with Canada. We have, again, a lot of tourists from Canada coming to California, and I think through most of the recent wars that we've had, the Canadians have been our allies, fighting along Americans.
Shoulder to shoulder.
And so, you know, again, California, I think our energy policy is very similar to that of the Canadians. We import, export. We're doing a good job. I just don't know what the issue is. Can't figure it out.
And on Mexico, what is the perspective from your constituents on the relationship with Mexico? I mean, you've already mentioned the importance of Mexican tourism and Mexico as an export market. Does that carry through to the average voter, do you think?
I think for the most part, yes. There's always going to be people at all levels, at parts of the spectrum. But in our area, I failed to mention there's a lot of folks in my area that are retiring to Mexico, okay? Just opened up some ARCO stations in Tijuana. And just closing my eyes, thinking about what's going on, there is more and more trade, more activity with Mexico. I believe that as the border, I thought, continues to open up and coming across the border becomes much simpler, I think more Americans will retire to Mexico. So to answer your question, I don't understand what the problem is. Shall we upgrade Nafta? Absolutely. A lot of the areas, a lot of the subject matters that we have today were not even thought of 25 years ago. We do need to upgrade Nafta. Today, as you know, we're talking trade deficits. I think for every dollar we import from Mexico, 46 cents is already U.S. product. For every dollar we import from China, it's about 2 cents. So you can't begin to compare apples and oranges to apples and oranges. I hope as policymakers that we sit down and deal with the facts and not with the rhetoric.
Thank you.
Let's do what's good for all Americans.
Absolutely.
So I represent 29 counties, 2 time zones, 820 miles of the border. It takes 10 and a half hours to drive across my district at 80 miles an hour, which is actually the speed limit. It is larger than...
This is not like a riding in England thing, I would imagine.
It is larger than 26 states, and it's roughly the size of Georgia. Okay. One of the problems, so when it comes to the bilateral relationship with Mexico, my district and our state at whole, we understand the importance of the relationship with Mexico. It's our #1 trading partner in the world, and you have our state elected officials that recognize that. Governor Abbott has been pretty vocal in his support about Nafta, and some of these changes are going to be disastrous to the Texas economy. Even before that, Governor Perry was a strong advocate for tight relations Senator Cornyn is an advocate, and most of the Republican delegation within the state of Texas is reflective of the importance of NAFTA. So I think that is an indication of where the people are, right? However, if you go to Eagle Pass and ask who owns Rossini, which creates thousands of jobs, they don't know that it's a Mexican company. When you're eating I've said this 100 times, when you're eating a delicious treat from Sara Lee, everybody knows Sara Lee, everybody's eating something from Sara Lee. They don't know that it's owned by Bimbo, a great Mexican company. Now, when you come to the bilateral relationship with Canada, can one of my constituents say, can you name a Canadian product that's important to your life, right, or a service? I think it would be hard, right, for them to do that. However, I'm quite confident that maybe with the exception of a fringe element, nobody believes that Canada is a national security threat to the United States. And so I would say most constituents recognize and understand and would say that Canada is our brother or our sister and our partner. And they also recognize the importance of how Canada has played, the role Canada has played in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria. People understand that. Back to Mexico, the violence, is in Mexico is really in 20% of the country. It's roughly 5 states. That has a disproportional influence on people's understanding of the country. What 100 politicians have been killed this election cycle. And so those are the kinds of issues that kind of color people's perspective when it comes to Mexico. Not all of Mexico is dangerous, but there are some places that are dangerous. And places along our border, El Paso, Eagle Pass, Del Rio, these are some of the safest cities in the United States of America. And I would agree with Lou, $66 billion is what the narco-traficantes are making in the United States of America. That's roughly the market cap at Target. Right? The U.S. intelligence budget is roughly $60 billion. Who's winning that war? Right? So yes, it is a demand that is feeding this, right? But also, when only 1% of people that commit a crime in Mexico go into a jail, that's a problem. And so those issues have a disproportionate influence on how people view. That's why we need more people going. I always tell people, this is a sophisticated crowd here. Mexico City has more Michelin-star restaurants than Paris or New York City, right? Some of the best beaches you could ever be able to go to. Those are the examples that should be in people's minds when you're thinking about Mexico.
Congressman Correa, I'd like to, you talked about the importance of people, you talked about the importance of immigration, so I'd like to put a direct question to you about the question of unauthorized immigration at this point in time, how you see the United States should respond to that surge in Central American migrants that we've seen over the past few years. And what are the best ways in which the United States and Mexico can work together on that? We've heard some inflammatory statements from the president saying that Mexico does nothing for the United States. I think everybody in this room knows that that's not true. Everybody knows in this room that Mexico has been cooperating with the United States at unprecedented levels. But do you see that there are more things that Mexico could be doing and more things that the United States could be doing, or different things they should be doing on the border?
I think the answer is there's many things that are probably being done we don't know about. They're just not public. And number two, we should be doing more. I'll get back to going back to the days when I was in the state Senate in California. I took a couple of Codels, we didn't call them Codels in California, a couple of tours to Mexico. And we discovered that with the USAID, through the Merida Accord, Mexico set up quite a sophisticated system of monitoring intelligence, everything that was, going through their, southern border as much as they could to monitor that. So they were keeping an eye on a lot of things that were probably important to American security. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of those images, the X-ray images that were processed in Mexico's southern border, then sent to Mexico City, I wouldn't be surprised if they ended up at Langley. So there's a lot of intel going on, a lot of things going on that have been happening for the last decade. Can we do more? Absolutely. And I think we're losing a golden opportunity. Instead of fighting in the press, instead of pointing fingers at Canada and Mexico, we could actually be coming up with a comprehensive solution to what's going on in Central America. And I alluded to that a few minutes ago when I talked about the 1,500 refugees that came to the Mexico's southern border, and only 350 made it to our border. That means that there was something actually going on in Mexico to address the issue. I think we could do a hell of a lot more when it comes to addressing those kinds of issues. The question is, can we get there? And it's not the administration's fault. I'm not going to point the finger at them, but rather I would say as Congress, as legislators, that's also on our shoulders. We need to come up with, like Will says, a few more trips to Mexico and figure out what we're doing and what else can we do to address these issues. MS-13, President talks about MS-13 quite a bit. We forget that MS-13 is alive and well in Central America. And, I can't even imagine what those families go through when those kids get to a certain age. They're given a choice, either to join MS-13 or you're shot. What do you do? And I think we could come up with some solutions for those families, for their families, so they can live better lives in Central America. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think there's some low-hanging fruit that we can address immediately.
And I'm just going to add on to Lou's last point. We have undercapitalized our diplomatic corps. We have undercapitalized y'all's neighbor, USAID. We do not give our diplomats the enough flexibility and freedom in order to do their job. And so if we were to help solve the root problems in those locations, you're not going to have the effect up here. And so it's being myopic by not trying to focus on the core problem. And that's why there's bipartisan legislation, part of our USA Act, dealing with the DACA population and border security, but also how do we commit funds to address these fundamental structural problems in Honduras and El Salvador and Nicaragua. And so our diplomatic corps, USAID, understand it. And I will say this, Secretary Pompeo understands the importance of our diplomatic corps, and I would like to let our ambassadors have more ability to make decisions and to do things locally without having to come back here and get something approved at Foggy Bottom or go all the way to the White House. No, we have these great ambassadors in these positions for a reason, and let them do their thing.
It was
Let
around,
me just
yeah,
add,
please.
if I may, to Will. He just brought up some good points. Immigration from Mexico to the U.S. is probably at zero now, or if not negative. Population growth has stabilized. Economic growth is alive and well in Mexico. Middle class is growing. The need to, at least the economic side, to immigrate is diminishing. That market, in terms of the middle class market, is growing for U.S. products. So it's working in Mexico. That just tells me we need to redouble our efforts in Central America to address these same issues in Central America. It's going to take time and effort, but it can be done, just like it's been happening in Mexico.
Just a point. I mean, it was around this time of year last year when Vice President Pence came to the Wilson Center, and he spoke in glowing terms about U.S.-Mexico cooperation in hosting discussions about Central America, about the development efforts that are underway there. Unfortunately, this year, that Mexican participation was canceled because of the inflammatory comments that were coming out of the United States. And so I really feel that we've lost that diplomatic opportunity, at least for the time being.
And it could potentially get worse. This rhetoric is having an impact on their national elections. And so, if this anti-negative rhetoric is something that voters are going to go and make a decision in Mexico, then what is the carryover effect to having antagonistic perspectives from the two leaders of those countries? So, as we agree, this relationship is much broader than just the people at the top, but people at the top can make it pretty tricky.
It was the third presidential debate in Mexico last night, and the leading candidate, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, actually said that whilst Nafta is very, very important for the future of Mexico, Mexico will survive without it. And I think we're beginning to see a recognition that, yes, there is definitely a need for an alternate strategy for Mexico. I'd like to put a question about the border and about the question of the wall. Congressman Correa, you said that it's not about building a wall. Congressman Hurd, you have introduced a border security bill focusing on technology as the key for improving border security. Can you give us your vision, both of you, about that? Maybe, Congressman Hurd, you could talk a little bit about the bill, first of all.
So, building a 30-foot-high concrete structure that takes 4 hours to penetrate from sea to shining sea is the most expensive and least effective way to do border security. There are parts of the border that Border Patrol's response time is measured in hours to days. If your response time is measured in hours to days, then a wall is not a physical barrier. And a wall is $24.5 million a mile. Using a smart wall technology is $500,000 a mile. If y'all haven't seen it, there's a recent article in Wired this week about a company that is deploying what I would call as the smart wall, and that's utilizing technology and artificial intelligence to determine the difference between a person and a bunny rabbit coming across the border, tracking that and being able to help Border Patrol be more effective. And in one test case at a ranch in my district, this rancher and Border Patrol in 2 years had only seen about 50 pounds of marijuana come through that in 2 years. In 2 weeks, they found almost 1,000 pounds and found a couple of dozen people coming across the border illegally when they previously didn't know. So it improves the effectiveness, it's cost effective, and allows the information that the men and women in Border Patrol need to get in their hands. That's how you do effective control. And you have to think of all 2,000 miles of border at the same time. In the 80s, everybody was coming across the bridge in San Diego. We put a lot of attention there, and then guess what? The bad guys moved, and now it was all coming through the Tucson sector, and then we focused there, and then they moved to RGV, and now we're focusing the Rio Grande Valley, and then it's going to move somewhere else. And so we got to figure out how we secure all 2,000 miles of border at the same time. And we need to be improving the information sharing that we're working with our Mexican colleagues, and we should be working with our friends in Mexico on their southern border as well, because they're dealing with some of the same challenges. That's a smarter approach to doing this. And as I said earlier, narcotraficantes and kingpin human smugglers making $66 billion a year. They do not have debates in Congress, on funding. They don't have. They're not worried about getting shut down, in October, and so they are better capitalized, and one tool will not work, because when we make a move, they're going to make a counter move. So that's why you have to go, the concept is called defense in depth. So we're doing multiple different things. We're not even looking at, we know Coast Guard. Coast Guard is only able to action 25% of the intelligence that they have on drugs coming in this country. That means 75, for those that aren't math majors, 75% of known traffic of drugs coming in our country, we can't stop. Why? Because Coast Guard doesn't have the resources. Okay, so let's take some of that wall money and give it to Coast Guard and give them some cutters, right? Like that is a better way, and we have to get out of thinking about a tactic, right? We shouldn't be saying, the way success is X number of drones or X number of miles of wall or X number of this. Success should be, are we seeing the amount of drugs coming into our country go down? Are we seeing the amount of illegal immigration coming into our country going down? Are we able to determine, at any point on the border, that what's coming back and forth? Those should be our measures of success, not any individual tool. And to be honest, I've never met anybody that disagrees with any of this.
You know, Will's absolutely right. We both serve on Homeland Security, and the Commandant of the Coast Guard came in and gave us testimony a few months ago saying that, I believe it was last year, 2016, 2017, the Coast Guard identified about 500 vessels, known vessels with drugs coming into the U.S., and they couldn't stop them. So you talk about bang for the buck. It's crazy. And, you know, talk about border security. I had the chance to go down to San Isidro, which is the biggest border crossing in probably the universe, if not the world, if not between the U.S. and Mexico. And one of the things I did was I went and started talking to the guys in uniform. And one gentleman was very proud. He had discovered a massive drug smuggling incident. And I went up to him, I said, "Sir, so how did you do it?" And he smiled like a Cheshire cat, you know. "Let me tell you how I did it." And he says, "I was walking up and down these crossing points, and I was looking at people, making eye contact, and I saw this lady, and she got nervous right away. So I looked at her a second time, and bingo, I knew I had something." Pulls over to secondary inspection, brings out the dogs, and you have a big, massive drug bust. So I told him, I asked him, I said, "So, you know, the resources you have here, do you have enough resources to check every car?" He says, "No, we have about enough resources to check about 10% of all the vehicles coming through." So I said, "If you have enough resources to check 20% of the cars, you think that your drug arrests, your drug busts will go up maybe twice?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "So what do you use?" He says, "I use personnel, trained personnel, and dogs, trained dogs to sniff out drugs." So I said, "Would you rather I invest the money on a wall or on the dogs and additional personnel?" Then he said no comment, and he walked away. So, you know, clearly from those folks where the rubber meets the road, most of the smuggling, most of the bad stuff happens at the border crossings now. We should be investing in x-ray machines, additional dogs, additional personnel. But you know, the president wants a wall. You'll probably get something, but if we're talking about border security, if we're talking about security of our population, I think we got to look at facts. The other issue, Will, you triggered a thought in my mind, which was cannabis smuggling. You know, now that California has made cannabis legal, I remember a few years back in the legislature, one of my former colleagues that had drank a little bit too much is telling me, "Lou, as soon as this stuff becomes legal, we're going to put the Mexicans out of business because we grow the best stuff in the world." And so here we are today. You got cannabis being smuggled across the border north, and we're producing it as well. So, which touches upon another issue, which is, you know, drug policy here in the U.S. as we move to not to incarcerate but to treat, not legalize but to treat. How are we going to work with the Mexican authorities and the other authorities on this issue? Anyway, interesting thoughts.
Thank you very much. I'd like to put two thoughts on the table as well, and they both involve what Mexico can do, but in cooperation with the United States. One is that Mexico desperately needs to boost its own border patrol. It needs to take its own border crossings a lot more seriously. So as you know, Mexico rightly complains about the flow of weapons and money back into Mexico, Mexico needs to do more on its borders to stop that flow. It can't just depend upon the United States, but that would be best handled in a cooperative manner with the United States. The second idea that I think is worth considering is...
That sounds like a grand deal to be cut.
It doesn't it? It really does. The second idea is this: Mexican ports. We know that a lot of contraband and a lot of illegal substances, maybe precursor chemicals, are coming in from Asia through Mexican Pacific ports. Why isn't the United States and Mexico working more closely together in those ports? For example, in Lázaro Cárdenas, to try to put in the best kind of technology that exists right now to prevent those substances from coming in. That's a real challenge, I think, for a lot of the Mexican port facilities. And it's a win-win-win for everybody because we're talking about infrastructure spending. We're talking about greater efficiencies at those ports as well. So I'd like to leave those on the tables. But I'd like to end this conversation on a bright note, okay? We're in the eye of the storm right now in many ways. I mean, Chris set us up for that. But is there a silver lining to the clouds here? Is there any way in which, in fact, we're focusing our vision so much more now on the bilateral relationship, on North America, on the border, that we are actually hoping to get a better understanding? Do you think that that's a likely outcome from all this, or do you think that it can go either way, or it's actually just more of a negative outcome?
I can say in the last 2 years, I've had more conversations with my colleagues across the aisle on trade than I ever thought was possible, and you realize that there is a lot more that we agree on than we disagree on. And so the fact that this is a topic that people are exposed to every single day and I start asking why. My older brother asked me one day, he's like, why should I care about Nafta? Mm-hmm. And I'm like, do you drink beer? And he goes, yes. Do you want to drink more expensive beer? He's like, no. Okay, then you should be supportive of Nafta. You know, it's like, how much does it cost to fill up your car? He's like, $75. I said, do you want it to be 100? He goes, no. I was like, you should care about Nafta, right? And he just has 2 girls, and they're 2 years old. I was like, you get to buy them clothes all the time, don't you? He's like, yeah. I was like, do you want it to be more expensive? And so these kinds of conversations are happening, and because of the acute problem, we are talking about what I've said was that chronic problem of understanding these issues. So I think, even though it's uncomfortable and it feels like we're not learning from this, I do believe that we're increasing the common body of knowledge on important relationships with Mexico and Canada, an important issue like trade.
Thank you. Congressman Correa.
You know, despite all the negativity that governments seem to bring to the table, it's my hope that business folks out there continue to do what's in their best interest, which is trade and grow, and that families continue to do what they've been doing for decades, which is go visit your families, you know, continue those cultural bonds, continue to do what is good for your community and for society. I think we just get the hell out of the way and let the businesses work together, get the heck out of the way and let people do what's good for these families. I think this world would be much better off. So it's my hope that, you know, I think all of us are looking at the Mexican elections, and I'm not here to support or endorse anybody. That's not my job. But after the elections are spoken for in Mexico, I'm hoping folks will get together and work for what's the best interest of citizens in both countries.
Well, I think we've learned here at the Wilson Center in general, the Mexico Institute in particular, this event every year, that you know, uncertainty and volatility are the things that really feed our existence. And in that sense, I have to say that the current U.S. president is very good for business. We have got a lot going on right now, I have to say. So if we can possibly bring in some more funding and then we can hire some more people, that would be a wonderful thing, okay? Gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, and thank you for your hard work on furthering understanding and for working for the better of the bilateral relationship. Many thanks for being here. A round of applause.